The history of Mecca. Did Mecca exist during Abraham's time? This is Daniel Amari from the Religion Research Institute. This episode is based on Dr. Rafat Amari's book, Islam in Light of History. In last episode, we discussed two types of archaeological data. We discussed the nations and the cities of Arabia and the extensive archaeological data we have for them, despite their short existence or a more ancient existence, or the fact they were in regions that have more rain than Mecca, yet Mecca has no historical record whatsoever for 2,400 years. We also discussed the archaeological data from different angles. We looked at the data in various areas, in various cities and various nations. We looked at their records. And we found that they mention each other, but they do not mention the city of Mecca. Mecca is absent from the records of other nations, of the archaeological other nations. The fact that even they mention Yathrib, but they don't mention Mecca. Now we come to the archaeological records of the nations that occupied the region where Mecca was built. So there were many nations that actually occupied the area where Mecca was eventually built. And we want to look at the data that they mention. There are many nations, both Arabian nations and non-Arabians, small nations and large empires that occupied the region where Mecca was eventually built. These nations kept records of the nations they occupied, the cities they traded with, the cities they had alliance with, yet they do not mention Mecca. They mention other cities and they mention other nations, but not Mecca. And the first nation we're going to be discussing is the nation of Ma'in. Ma'in occupied Hijaz, and its inscriptions are found in northern Arabia because Ma'in is in the south. Its inscriptions is found in Didan, found also in south of Iraq, south of Jordan, but not Mecca. Lihyan controlled the northwestern of Arabia, yet no mention of Mecca. Nabateans colonized the land route towards the south, including the land where Mecca was eventually built, yet the Nabateans do not mention Mecca. We're going to be looking right now at Kinda, because Kinda controls center all western Arabia, yet it did not mention Mecca. The Himyarites controlled the area where Mecca was later built, yet no mention of Mecca during the 3rd century AD. That is very significant. Mecca was absent from Assyrian inscriptions. Assyrians controlled Arabia. They controlled the Arabian desert and the spice route. At one point, they controlled Egypt, Eastern Mediterranean lands, Ethiopia. They documented all of these as south as Yemen. Assyrian inscriptions described Arabian tribes, rulers, religious centers, cities, yet there is no mention of Mecca, there is no mention of the tribes such as Jurhum. Mecca is absent very significantly from the Assyrian inscriptions when you consider the kind of information that the Assyrians kept. They kept information about cities, tribes, religious centers, regions they controlled. They kept information about cities that paid tribute to them, cities that they traded with, cities that they warred with, cities they had alliance with. They controlled Arabia for centuries, documented all of it, and yet no mention of Mecca. I mean, this is very significant. Initially, in the last episodes, or the last two episodes, we mentioned archaeological data, the fact that Arabian cities and nations had wealth and extensive archaeology, mentioning series of kings. We mentioned also the fact that these inscriptions mention each other, yet Mecca is absent, internally and externally. We continue with the Assyrians. And we focus right now on the land of Bazu in central of Arabia. There were no more cities to be conquered in northwestern Arabia. So the Assyrians marched to central Arabia to the land of Bazu. Central Arabia, close to the Persian Gulf. Arid land, saline ground, waterless region, covered with sand, thorny plants, scorpions and snake. That's the description that they had for that land for Western Arabia. They burned 7 walled cities in Bazur and appointed a king there. It demonstrates the depth of penetration and influence the Assyrian had, and that there were no more land in Arabia to conquer. Think about this way. If Mecca was the most significant city of Arabia, the center of trade, the center of monotheism, all the way from 2000 BC to the 4th century AD, how come it is absent, utterly absent from Assyrian inscriptions? No mention, despite the fact that the Assyrians were hungry to find land, to find any place to conquer. Mecca was not there. Now we come to the Chaldean Babylonian occupation of Hijaz. King Nebuchadnezzar raided the Arabs several times. King Nabonidus occupied northern Arabia, made Taima his residence. Then he occupied Dedan, Fadak, Khaybar, Yadi, and Yathrib, about 200 miles away from Mecca. He controlled the whole region, including central Western Arabia, yet no mention of Mecca. One thing very important to consider. This king did not just occupy northern Arabia, but he made Taima in northern Arabia to be his residence. And from there, he controlled Western Arabia. Yet, no mention of Mecca. If you look at the Chaldeans' trade records, trade along Arabian routes to the Fertile Crescent increased and flourished. Chaldean records reflected the increase in trade activity and the relationship with Arabian merchants. Yet, one thing that is very significant is no mention of Mecca or the merchants of Mecca. The merchants of Mecca were absent from the Chaldean trade records. And this is important because the Islamic claim states that Mecca was the center of trade of Arabia. Yet, it was absent from the Chaldean records of trade. We come to Persian occupation. Persians controlled the region. Northern Arabia, Persian Gulf, Oman, Jura, known today as Al-Qatif. Persians made alliance with Kinda, which controlled Central Arabia, and part of Hadramaut, south of Yemen, and Lakhamids in Al-Hira. Yet, no mention of Mecca. The Roman Empire. Roman had expeditions that occupied the region, but they had no mention of Mecca. As we have seen, whatever way you look at archaeology, if you looked at the archaeology of Arabia, you'll find extensive archaeology for the nations and the cities of Arabia, whether you talk about the north, the south, or the east of Mecca. Yet Mecca had no archaeology. And if you look at the Arabian records, they mention each other, yet they don't mention Mecca. And if you look at the extensive historical record and archaeological records of nations and empires that occupied the region where Mecca was built later, you will find mention of all kind of information except Mecca, except the merchants of Mecca. This demonstrates that archaeology eliminates the existence of Mecca from 2000 BC to the 4th century AD. During this 2,400 years, Mecca did not exist. This is Daniel Ammari from the Religion Research Institute.